Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of The Bulwark, and it is primary season. If you follow national politics, you have probably heard something about the Republican primary for Senate in Ohio, which has been a spectacle of candidates trying to out-MAGA one another. To give you an idea of just how nasty this race has gotten, two of the candidates had to be physically separated at a recent debate. The candidates are author J.D. Vance, former Ohio Treasurer Josh Mandel, businessman Mike Gibbons, former Ohio Republican Party Chair Jane Timken, and State Senator Matt Dolan, the only non-completely MAGA candidate in the race. We're going to hear from undecided Republican voters in Ohio right now, GOP primary voters, and discuss how the big themes of the race have landed. All of the people we talked to backed Trump in both 2016 and 2020. But most of these voters, I guess, are what political scientists or sometimes on TV, they call them low information voters, which I just want to be clear does not mean a dumb voter. It simply means somebody who does not follow politics like it's their job, which probably makes them a smart voter. And because they're slightly less plugged in politically, they're also somewhat less overtly partisan than a lot of the other groups we talk to and that you hear on this podcast. My guest today is Dave Weigel, national political reporter for the Washington Post. He's coming to us from Ohio on the ground and has been there during the home stretch of this race. He's also an old pal of mine. Dave, where are you in Ohio right now?
It's good to be here. I wish I had a more exciting dateline this second. I'm in Cleveland because I'm catching up with some candidates later today. But I've been to most of the corners of the state. I guess there's only 4. I've been to 3 quarters of the state covering the candidates over the last week.
Do you have like a connection to Ohio? I don't know if I've ever mentioned this to you. I only mention it occasionally, like every 5 minutes, that I went to Kenyon College there in Ohio. So I love Ohio.
I like it. I started going there for stories in 2012. So I spent a week right before the 2012 election in a politically very different state. I was going to cover campaign stops by Bill Clinton in Appalachia, which did not happen in 2020 for a bunch of reasons. And so I've come here and I've seen the politics shift. I wouldn't say in real time because I've been back and forth, but I'm from Wilmington, Delaware, and I think it's okay that there's a Delaware County here. I'm not sure if it's legal, but I really enjoyed exploring it. I mean, you have in this race this smorgasbord of ethnic groups and political clubs, and a race that's kind of been flattened out because in the Republican primary, the Trump endorsement was the prize that every candidate except Dolan, as you were saying, was going for. And so you had some candidates trying to appeal to the usual different constituencies in Ohio. Then you had Trump coming in and I wouldn't say obliterating that, TBD, but really changing the way the electorate was moving in this race.
When you say it's changing, it's interesting because Ohio used to be sort of the consummate bellwether state. I remember Kenyon would kind of get famous around election time, because it was such a close state, a swing state. And now, I mean, I think it was Trump plus state in 2020. So when you say it's changed, what do you think has changed?
It's pretty simple. So you had, like in the rest of the Midwest, a white working class, non-college educated vote that was pretty split. You had unionized Democrats, generational Democrats in Eastern Ohio and Appalachia, and they stayed with the party. Even when Ronald Reagan was running for president, they were Democrats. Same kind of thing you see in parts of Michigan, parts of Pennsylvania. You had in 2016, I'd say more than 2014. You started to see some slippage in 2014 in those areas for Democrats. But in 2016, there was this gigantic swing over of a lot of those voters, hundreds of thousands of those white working class voters, to the Republican Party to vote for Donald Trump. And that was concentrated, again, in kind of the counties along the Ohio River, places like Trumbull County and the Mahoning Valley. The Republicans barely even competed for generations in those places. They moved, and the Democratic Party, even if it ran candidates that were a little bit more ideologically akin to those voters, your Ted Stricklands, your Tim Ryans in his district, they still were shifting. The Republicans have done a very good job attaching the National Democratic brand to the party here. Environmentalism, LGBT rights, gun control, all the things the Democrats could ameliorate on a little bit when they were more competitive in the state, they moved. I remember talking to Tim Ryan in 2020 about Joe Biden running, and he was very confident. You have to say this, but I believe he felt it, that Hillary Clinton was just a fluky, awful candidate for the state that year. He didn't say awful. Joe Biden was connecting in a way that she didn't. It didn't really happen. I mean, Joe Biden did not move the needle at all. You had 81 counties of 88 vote for Donald Trump, including Mahoning, which was unthinkable for years. Democrats have made up some of the losses by doing much, much better in suburban Cincinnati, suburban Columbus, and suburban Cleveland, but really not gaining anywhere else. They used to win a huge string of counties in the southeast part of the state. You've seen this, the focus groups, you've seen this around the country. The patterns that shifted white working class voters away everywhere have happened here. The problem for Democrats and the opportunity for Republicans is just there are not that many suburban Republicans, not as many non-white voters. The parts of the Democratic coalition they can kind of patch together to make up for this just aren't in enough number in the state to make up for those losses.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've basically encapsulated the political realignment that is making the world difficult for Democrats, which is that there are just a lot more white working class voters, especially in these swing states, including more of a Hispanic bloc too. And there just aren't enough suburban voters. So anyway, let's get into it here, okay? I want to start by talking about J.D. Vance. He's fresh off Trump's latest endorsement, author of Hillbilly Elegy, celebrated by coastal elites as a look into the mind of the Trump voter. And he has since morphed into a MAGA tough guy after strongly condemning Trump in 2016. When I hear people play his old hits, I think, God, what a nice never Trumper he sounds like. He said a couple of months ago that he doesn't really care what happens in Ukraine one way or another, which is, I don't know, kind of wild even in a Republican primary these days. But let's listen to what the voters thought. And again, these are undecided voters, but let's hear what they think of Vance.
He kind of made his own way, coming from kind of a crummy ass background. So I feel like he's kind of a little bit more in touch than maybe some of the other candidates because he's been poor and middle class and well off at this point. At the same time, he has a military background, but it's not like it's in his ads, but it's not like, I'm into the military. I'm a great military guy. Military's great. And he just seems a little more, I don't know, relatable.
I think he's really pro small business. That's just something that's important to me and my family. So that's a big reason why I like what I see with him.
He comes from a blue collar town. He had a, regular upbringing, that he is big on small business, a lot of the typical Republican values that I believe in.
I think that everybody here kind of likes people that aren't real politicians. And I don't want to speak on behalf of any of you guys, but I would love a breath of fresh air.
A breath of fresh air, like a New Yorker celebrated author. It's not clear. I want to play one more segment before we talk about Vance, because it's not clear how much Trump's endorsement is going to influence their decision about whether to vote for Vance or not. But let's hear what they say about that.
Just because, Trump is supportive of Vance, it doesn't mean I'm going to necessarily vote for him.
It doesn't mean a whole lot to me as far as it's not going to make me go from hating someone to not hating them just because they're endorsed by someone else by any means.
I get the whole backing of a candidate, but show me what you are about, not what Trump thinks you're about.
So, Dave, as best I could tell from the reporters that I talked to, everybody is very, very interested in this question of what does Trump's endorsement do for a candidate? And I think a lot of people were surprised, including many Trump faithful, that he endorsed J.D. Vance. But as much as these voters say that Trump's endorsement doesn't matter to them, I just want to point out that a couple months ago, when we were doing focus groups in Ohio voters, J.D. Vance was barely registering with people. And, it was all Mandel all the time. Like him or hate him, that's who they'd heard of. And so I think that they may be discounting it, but this is the most positive Ohio group I've ever heard talk about J.D. Vance. And there's only one thing that's changed.
That's interesting because, again, I've been here a week and I came a couple months ago when Marjorie Taylor Greene was campaigning with Vance. And I was finding that Donald Trump's rally for Vance, I was finding voters just didn't know a lot about him. These are Trump voters who showed up for a Trump rally. It was nice that J.D. Vance was there. They liked his speech. But they had not been paying attention to literally a year of campaigning and attacks. And I'm pointing out in the story I'm writing about the race that there were anonymous texts that were coming to people in Ohio, and I got some by accident, that were just blasting his anti-Trump quotes from 2016, the period we're talking about, and saying, he's a never-Trumper, read this link. There was this really concerted effort to make it infamous how much he'd criticized Trump. And I talked to Vance about that, and he said, yeah, it really hurt. The first few months of the campaign, the Club for Growth kept him down, and he struggled to get off the mat. In the broader picture of the race, what happened was the Club for Growth that spent most of the money against Vance was endorsing Josh Mandel. After they thought they took care of Vance, just kept blasting everybody else. So Jane Timken, the former party chair, they used a quote she'd said about one of the congressmen who impeached Trump and used that to say, well, she's anti-Trump too. And they took Mike Gibbons, they took some stuff he'd said about he's not part of a cult of personality around Trump. They took that and they beat him over the head with that. And they made it look like just there really was no pro-Trump candidate in the race. You were putting up the context, but in 2016, his argument in the argument in Hillbilly Elegy is, I'm from this part of the country that's been left behind. Donald Trump is not the answer. We need to be self-sufficient and challenge our culture and succeed. And that argument has evolved. I wouldn't say it's flipped, like a lot of people say. Again, I was in Youngstown yesterday, and the Youngstown Vindicator was asking a very good question. Said, hey, here are some quotes from your book about how we can't just blame China for the problems we're having. Why are you blaming China now? And he said, well, you can have both. You need to have a theory of why we have been left behind, which is exploitation, free trade, China, and you have to challenge people and say they should be self-sufficient. And so he had a year to finesse that argument. I think he's done a pretty good job of it.
Interesting. You mentioned the Club for Growth had just been beating him up. They have not stopped now that Trump has endorsed him. They're like still, which I think is really interesting because I had been really thinking about the Club for Growth for a while now. It's kind of the Club for Trump, very pro-Trump. And so they're still out there. In fact, we've got an ad. I just want to play it really quickly. They just dropped a new ad against Vance post-endorsement. Let's listen to it.
The elites were right about Donald Trump, right? I'm a never Trump guy.
Has Trump seen this?
President Trump tweeting a surprise endorsement of Mitt Romney for his run.
How'd that turn out?
Look, I love Trump, but he's getting it wrong with J.D. Vance, too.
I might have to vote for Hillary Clinton. People who voted for Trump voted for him for racist reasons.
Where does he get off saying that?
We've got our own eyes and our own ears. J.D. Vance is a fraud.
In an earlier ad, the Club for Growth put out, it prompted Trump's assistant to text the Club for Growth, go F yourself. What do you make of this open war over the candidates in Ohio between Trump and Club for Growth?
I keep thinking of The Wire and Slim Charles saying, this is war. Doesn't matter who started it. Once you're in it, you're in it. And the Club for Growth is pot committed to supporting Mandel. They have a relationship with him. Donors have a relationship with him. And they simply are sticking to it. And look, the politics are different. Vance is a nationalist conservative of a kind that I think has been profiled very well recently. That is anti-free trade, social conservative, doesn't think tax cuts are the solution to problems, really wants to crack down on tech companies, break them up. You see this attitude on Tucker Carlson's show. That is not from completely overlapping with the Club for Growth, laissez-faire, free market, cut taxes attitude. So they do have disagreements with him and they want him to lose. But the disagreements are not that big that justify this level of spending, which has been immense. So Vance, actually, if he wins this race, in one way, it's a story of an underdog, because the last time he reported his finances, so in beginning of April, he had raised $2.5 million. I mean, that's compared to Mike Gibbons, the businessman, spent 17 plus. Matt Dolan, the guy who's not seeking the Trump endorsement, spent $11 million. Those are both self-funders. People had a lot of money. They outspent him. The club spent tons of money against him, and he was hit with about $6 million of attack ads. He was floated by Peter Thiel's super PAC, which did not really tout his trade ideas as much as its focus was a little bit biography and a lot on immigration. He ran as more of a nationalist populist candidate than the club is comfortable with, but the club has let those people get through or get their support in other kind of primaries. Man, I don't see a ton of disagreement between some of Vance's positions and some of Mo Brooks's positions, and they're all in for Mo Brooks. But that has really flooded the race, and I would say with the Club for Growth, that is a sentiment I've heard. I have met a decent number of Republican voters who don't really trust Vance, not because he wrote for The Atlantic, because his book was a bestseller or adapted by Ron Howard. Not that stuff. They just heard him say that stuff about Hillary and Trump, and they don't really trust him. I mean, he still gets questions. It's T-minus a few days till the primary, and I've been with him, and he still gets questions saying, I saw this ad. It says this about you. I'm not sure if I can trust you. And he does his best. Room by room, he can kind of convert people. But that attitude is there. Where is this guy? How do we know we can trust him? Is he as reliable a conservative as Mandel is? I think he has benefited from just Mandel is not really a dominant candidate. He never has been. He's always kind of rushed in with a lot of support and a lot of money, but struggled to close the deal.
What's interesting with these low information voters, and look, the undecided chunk in Ohio, it's getting smaller now, but it was pretty big there for a while, even with a lot of candidates in the race. But when we asked the low information voters, or these people who are not so plugged into politics, what they thought about his kind of changing course on Trump, they didn't care that much. Here, listen to what they said.
People are allowed to change their minds.
I don't know that I think it's flip-flopping as much as, Trump isn't always the most likable person. And so I think you can support what he does and not always like how he does it or things that he says. And so I think that's really all he's done is sort of kind of stood against some of the things that Trump has said. And that's been kind of labeled a flip-flop.
Who of us here who voted for him haven't sometimes thought, Jesus, why would you say that? Or the result was good, but the delivery wasn't quite right. I think all of us have had that love-hate relationship at some point, maybe. So flip-flopping on Trump is not a surprise.
I actually kind of loved these answers because it does remind you, right, that there's this whole cohort of people who aren't following this stuff super closely. And so they're not hard partisans. Mm-hmm. And so, the fact that he was kicking Trump around, they're like, yeah, well, Trump was kind of a jerk sometimes. But the latest polling does have Vance now going from a pretty lagging fourth to the top of the pack. And so I think this is where Trump's endorsement is really helping.
Yeah, it's a crowded race, and it's not exactly 2016, but it's another case where, there are polls for other campaigns, for Gibbons, for Dolan, that have them ahead. Mandel's campaign claims ahead. Timken's the one who's kind of fallen off the map. She really needed that Trump endorsement, and there was a lot of work done to make sure she didn't get it. But that sentiment you're talking about, it's not unique to Trump. I mean, when Democrats were trying to sell Hillary Clinton to people, there was a lot of, well, yes, I admit she's made mistakes, but a lot of that. And there's a T-shirt I see Ohio and elsewhere that says, I would take $2 gas on a mean tweet right now. And sort of this compartmentalization, forgetting a lot of stuff that happened in the Trump years. It says everything was great, everything was awesome, except for his personality got him in trouble. The opinions of presidents, Trump is actually lagging on this, opinions of presidents when they're out of office often shift upward. People say, remember that, unless it's a Jimmy Carter situation where they have 100% negative association, they tend to increase. But even with Jimmy Carter, he's much more popular than he used to be. So I've seen that, and I would also add in Ohio, this is a good place to be someone like J.D. Vance, where you didn't support Trump from the beginning, but you came around to him. John Kasich beat Trump in the primary. Trump won the state big in the general election, but if you go back and met every single Ohio Republican voter in 2016, most of them didn't vote for Trump in the primary. And I've met a lot of them on the trail, and they kind of flagellate themselves for voting for John Kasich or voting for Ted Cruz instead of Donald Trump. So when someone like a Vance shows up and says, I wasn't there at the beginning, but I was wrong, I've seen him get applause for saying I was wrong. And it's a little bit remarkable if you've seen other Republicans go down, lose because of much less fulsome attacks on Donald Trump than J.D. Vance ever gave. But it's real. I have seen it.
Yeah, and part of it too is like Trump is letting him off the hook. I mean, not only endorsing him, but let's listen to what Trump said when people are like, why are you endorsing J.D. Vance? He was so mean about you.
You know what? He's a guy that said some bad shit about me. He did. But you know what? Every one of the others did also. In fact, if I went by that standard, I don't think I would have ever endorsed anybody in the country. You want to know?
So I had predicted that Trump would endorse Vance to my Bulwark colleagues, and it was really mainly over one thing where Trump doesn't like anything more than taking a never Trumper and just like breaking their spirit and making them go full MAGA. Like he just loves that.
Absolutely. And Vance did it personally. He also communicated through these channels that Trump takes very seriously. I mean, he was on Newsmax and
Tucker.
I mean, he was a constant guest on Steve Bannon. I should say, and who cares about reporters about this? He's been very helpful with reporters. I mean, there's campaigns that don't talk to people. He'll kind of jab an elbow if he thinks reporters are unfair, but he's been accessible. He's been very media forward, and he has just genuine talent as a candidate that some of the other people in this race were lacking. It was very clear in the debates. He just was better at debating. Timken was a little bit stuck on her talking points. He really is a non-politician. He's just a wealthy businessman with conservative views, and he kind of struggles to explain them on some things. Mandel was really over the top a lot of the time, just and the fight you mentioned at the top of the podcast where he confronts Gibbons on stage, that was like a 2-week fight over whether Gibbons saying he never worked in the private sector was some sort of insult of his military service. I mean, that was a fight that got into TV ads. If you're watching that, you're Donald Trump. It looks like some of these guys are tripping over themselves, and one guy is very confident. And I think that definitely helped Vance secure that endorsement. He also had a strategy that it was pretty blatant. They talk about it, which was, all right, everyone wants the Trump endorsement. Everyone wants Trump allies, surrogates to endorse him, which you've seen people who supported Trump endorse other candidates. Corey Lewandowski went to work for Timken, etc. Their strategy was, we're the candidate that people think is anti-Trump. So when we get a Robert Lighthizer, when we get a Marjorie Taylor Greene, when we get somebody from Trump world, we kind of want to put them in front of us like a shield, like a phalanx. And if you think that J.D. Vance is anti-Trump, well, why don't you talk to Robert Lighthizer about it? He thinks that he's the best Trump candidate on trade. So they really just had a thought-through strategy of what do we take about the Trump message? And the narrative was this is a guy who's from the heartland, came up with nothing, didn't like Trump, but has discovered that MAGA was right all along. I mean, that's a very simple narrative. And other candidates, once they got questioned, hey, for example, Mandel has been hit by Donald Trump Jr. for not campaigning for Trump in 2016 or 2020. And when those guys are asked about that, they don't have a great answer. Where Vance's answer, ironically, of, yeah, I was wrong, is very straightforward and very relatable to a lot of Ohio Republicans.
Totally. Well, let's talk about Josh Mandel, the other main character in this race. He's been running for office in Ohio off and on for over a decade, even though he's only 44. And some of the focus group members talked about what a baby he looked like. So he was a Rubio guy in 2016 before morphing into this MAGA diehard. And when you say over the top is right. Listen to just a little bit from his stump.
I want to say it very clearly for every journalist here, for everyone watching out home, for everyone here in the church. I believe this election was stolen from Donald J. Trump. We need to get rid of this January 6th commission and replace it with a November 3rd commission.
So these Mandel comments, they get a lot of national attention because he sounds like such a weirdo. But the Ohio voters that we talked to had sort of a more generic critique of Mandel as a political candidate. Let's listen to what they said.
I'm not impressed and not impressed. He always talks about being in the military, which is fine. He looks younger than he is. You're like, good Lord, is he old enough to vote? Impression-wise, I can't really say I know enough about him that I've made a final decision, but he's not in one of my top ones to really look at, I don't think.
Not a fan of him at all. I don't know. Just to me, it's all about the military for him. He just comes across very arrogant, in my opinion. I don't know. It just doesn't come down to earth and just not for me at all.
He's been perpetually running for Ohio office for the past 10 or 15 years. And I think he might have won one of those races. But he's like a perpetual candidate. And he really tries to out-conservative all the other conservatives. And I don't think he has a very good track record of success.
He keeps using the military, which I have a deep respect for the military, but I'm not sure that that's something that you should like. When candidates, keep running to that same type of thing that is sort of irrelevant, it makes me question like substance a little bit.
So, Dave, I find Josh Mandel to be repellent. To be clear, I kind of find J.D. Vance to be repellent too, but Mandel is like, there's something, I don't know, sociopathological about him. But like, what are you hearing on the ground about him, or what's your impression of how he's run this race?
Well, those voters really pinpointed it. So Mandel has been running forever, and he's also just a terrible person to make the argument that Vance was not a true MAGA candidate. He was a Democrat. He was a college Democrat. And then turned around, came back, ran for office, and won as a Republican, had a meteoric rise, and got more right-wing over the years. He just did. And so he led with his chin when he suggested that Vance is a latecomer to MAGA, because it's very easy to find videos of him doing what was the mainstream Republican thing at whatever time he was running. And that was endorsing campaigning with Mitt Romney in 2012. That was endorsing Marco Rubio in 2016. And so he is a loyal Republican, but ideologically has been harder to pin down. He's been doing it for more than a decade. Vance emerged on the scene 6 years ago. And so that idea, too, that he leans on his military service, it's all he talks about, what else is going on, that is noticeable. I mean, in his ads, I mentioned the fight with Gibbons, which I think alienated a lot of people. I mean, his poll numbers dropped after that. It's every ad. I mean, one of his slogans is "Send in the Marine." He's invoked the military service and used the photos in every ad. Now, there are candidates who do that. Like Tom Cotton does that. If you have military experience, you generally talk about it, but it can put people off if it is all that you talk about, or if it is your answer to everything, which is what it became for Mandel. If you criticize me, you're criticizing a veteran and a warfighter. And Vance, I think, had a benefit here, which is that he was a Marine. He served in the public affairs side. He's not like John Kerry in 2004 telling war stories, talking about his war buddies. I even noticed in the movie adaptation of Hillbilly Elegy, it barely mentions that he served in the military. It wasn't a big part of his story. And it's not a big part of the story for this campaign. Just, yeah, I served. And I feel like that has hit people a little bit better, because there are people who find it obnoxious, especially if they served, if it's somebody who's banging the table again and again, talking about nothing else.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Vance had kind of a breakout moment. Like he really capitalized on that low moment between Mandel and Gibbons by saying, he kind of like rounded up after that fight by saying, you know what, Josh Mandel, I think the way that you demagogue the military is disgraceful. And I think gave voice to what a lot of people felt about how he was doing it. Hey, but just speaking of Gibbons really quickly, Gibbons in the polling, which I don't know how reliable this Ohio polling is just all over the map, and they all have their internals, and they're all winning in their internals. But Gibbons, as Vance and Mandel were kind of going at it, Gibbons had kind of emerged as a front runner and now seems to have dropped back. Was that the fight too? Is Gibbons like a dark horse here who could break through, or what's your feeling on him?
Yeah, well, Gibbons ran in 2018 for Senate. He jumped in with kind of the same campaign. I'm a businessman who's not a politician who supported Donald Trump from the beginning. I'm an outsider. And he has, he's not unlimited wealth, but he's wealthy enough to self-fund a ton of TV advertisements, bus tour, all this stuff. And there are periods, and we see this in lots of campaigns. We saw this, Michael Bloomberg surges and then he collapses. If you're alone on the air, you can do pretty well. So for a while, if you're watching TV in Ohio, the candidate you were hearing the most positive stuff about was Mike Gibbons. And he, as a candidate, is just not a natural. There's such a thing as a natural politician. He is just really kind of normal guy who's into politics. And so sometimes when Ukraine comes up or some issues comes up, he doesn't have an immediate position on them. Vance has made fun of him, saying he can't string 4 words together and make a sentence, which is a little bit mean, but he had a ton of money to introduce himself and a pretty good story to tell. But he's not been an exciting candidate. He also, and Timken has the same problem, they haven't really told a story, a theme. Like, they really did bounce from theme to theme to theme, depending on what was in the news. Timken especially. Timken, it was school, it was parents' rights, it was immigration, it was inflation, and there wasn't a clear theme there. Gibbons did the same thing, just blasting on every single issue. And once other candidates emerged and had some time to do something a little more consistent and coherent, he suffered. And it wasn't even from that confrontation on stage. But his theory of things is, I got momentum, and then other candidates went in the air, and a lot of it was negative, and I fell.
Well, it's funny. You mentioned Jane Timken, who's now running dead last. She did surprisingly well in this focus group. Let's listen to what voters had to say for her.
I just can see her as someone that can just connect with a lot of people and is likable. Is doing a lot. Even as a Republican, she's doing a lot of sort of, I could see her capturing undecided voters.
She's probably in one of my top ones of the ones that are running, just from the background I've seen on her and things like that. Because again, she doesn't seem like she's a politician, and she ain't an old guy. And she seems very relatable and likable.
I think she was kind of wanting to be kind of the Trump candidate for the Senate race, and big on jobs and economy, obviously talking lower taxes, looking at how can she help individual, especially with this rising inflation, big on education. So overall, I think positive things.
Were you surprised to see her get so much from this group?
Yeah, when I was seeing these answers, I was surprised, because one thing I've heard Republicans don't like or talk about is she had this ad try and make a splash. It did. I don't think I think it splashed back on her, where she walks into a room with pictures of the other candidates, not Dolan, but the other kind of MAGA lane candidates, and says, "We all know guys who have to overcompensate for something." The innuendo, I don't need to explain a woman talking about men overcompensating, but it was kind of a labored way to say I was with Trump from the beginning and these guys weren't. And there's a lot of that just asserting I was with Trump since the beginning. She also, I keep mentioning the debates. Maybe I rate them a little bit higher than the average voter. But she really stuck to a couple lines in the debates. For example, I'm a mom on a mission. I'm going to lead with grace and grit. You shouldn't punish a candidate if they're on message. But she often seemed when someone like Vance was ready or kind of bold and taking a new stance, she wasn't. I mean, one thing that I think was important in the race that has not been mentioned as much in the close is there's this debate. Congress is debating whether to raise the debt limit for a couple years at the end of 2021. And Vance just kind of on a whim says, I think they should shut down the government until they get rid of the vaccine mandate. And it was a good example of just kind of thinking on his feet, taking a hardline conservative position that no one else had tested. And I'm not trying to damn Timken by comparing to Vance, but she's never really done that. And she's kind of been, when an issue's been bubbling up, she's like parents' rights, like the school board, she jumped onto me. One of the smartest things she did was spending some campaign resources to help school board candidates in 2021 in the off-year elections. But she couldn't really capitalize on that. And she also, I think, spent money ineffectively. I mean, I mentioned that she was paying Corey Lewandowski a retainer to work for the campaign. That did really nothing. This is one of those Trump endorsements I think made less sense than the ones Vance has. Lewandowski wasn't out there defending her Trump bona fides. It was just, hey, I also work for Trump and she worked with us and she's fine. So telling the story of how she turned Ohio red, I think it made some sense. It has not cohered. It's only a couple polls that have showed her lagging, but it's very clear she needed, and her strategy was, to get some momentum and get Trump to endorse her and be the Trump choice, because she was generally pretty acceptable to people. I mean, one striking thing in that Fox poll that shows Vance up is she's the least liked candidate. I think that has a lot to do with just that one ad and with not really finding another way to break out and reintroduce herself to voters. And that's right. And in that focus group you see, she had some natural appeal. I mean, she's one of those candidates where I think the advertising and the scripting of what she did in public just is not as natural as her on the trail. Like the reasons that she has a lot of fans within the party, the reason that she was popular with the grassroots, it hasn't really translated to the TV stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hey, I just want to ask you about Dolan really quickly. So Gibbons and Dolan, neither of them were registering at all with the voters, but Dolan is the only one who isn't running explicitly as a MAGA candidate. In fact, not an anti-Trump candidate, but kind of like a move past Trump candidate. And in my world of disaffected, sad Republicans, he's a heavy favorite. And so there's a few polls that have shown him gaining of late. And there's a theory kicking around that, if it's the same as the Gibbons thing, but if Vance and Mandel kind of destroy each other here going into the end, that you end up with somebody like Gibbons sneaking through. You think there's any merit to that?
I think it is possible. I'll back up a second. There's two candidates who I think had a strategy from the beginning of the race that has played out. Vance's strategy was reintroduce himself as somebody who now is a real Trump nationalist MAGA candidate. Dolan's strategy was don't bother with the Trump stuff and say everyone else is focused on somebody else while I'm focused on Ohio. And he has steadily built support from nothing. It helped that he has some personal wealth that he can put into it. A thing that honestly hurt him, that, again, Vance took advantage of, was the Dolan family owns Cleveland's baseball team, which over the course of the race changed its name from the Indians to the Guardians. And that is just such an easy thing to attack in a race where wokeness, the threat of wokeness, changing culture, all that stuff, where that does anger voters, that motivates Republican voters. I definitely say, let's say the polls are surprising and Dolan comes second to Vance by a couple points. I think that might have been decisive because he's had to keep reintroducing himself from that. But his strategy has been sound. And he has not been anti-Trump. So, and it's honestly a little bit like Glenn Youngkin's strategy in Virginia, which is, I'm not worried about Trump. He's got his own race. We need election integrity, sure, but let's move on from 2020. I mean, he's actually said we need to move on. Trump needs to move on. We can't govern if we don't move on. But he's run as like a conservative candidate who's done conservative things. All his ads emphasize border control, attacking Biden, talking about open borders, tax cuts, anti-abortion. I mean, he's not a liberal Republican, ever like Larry Hogan. He's not. He's running as a conservative who just thinks everyone else is playing a silly game with Trump. And it's been pretty effective. I mean, no poll has shown him, except for some internals, running away with it. But he has steadily built that support.
So do you have a prediction? Do you think it's Vance?
I think Vance has the momentum. He says on the trail that they now see the campaign like winning solidly. The only thing they're worried about is like last minute attacks, moving people back away from him. Because you mentioned the Club for Growth ad. That's back on the air. You turn on TV and it's you can't trust this guy. He hates Trump. I think the combination of how big the field is, nobody's getting out of the way. There's some people sunk in with the air candidates. I think he can win this with a plurality. I see a bigger path for him than anyone else who's running.
Yeah. Well, let me just ask you as a last question before we wrap here. Tim Ryan, I've been pretty interested in this race, not just because the Republican side's such a circus, but Tim Ryan is running as kind of a Sherrod Brown type of Democrat. I think that the Democrats would do well to have more candidates like him in key places. And I always thought if it was Mandel, because people really do dislike Mandel, actively dislike him, that Tim Ryan stood actually a real shot, even though the state has gotten really red. I'm not so sure about that with Vance, but what do you make of the general election potential for Ryan?
Ryan is probably the most promising candidate that Democrats could have run. I mean, there was an effort to draft Amy Acton, who was the state health director during COVID. I think that would have been a disaster, just the way people's minds have changed on the importance of pandemic preparedness, like it or not. Ryan also did something, again, there's been so much blundering in this race. Whenever something smart happens, they take note of it. Ryan did something very smart. His first TV ad was, they did a couple spots where they kind of recreate his stump speech, and in a high school gym, and he's talking about the threat of China, how there's one word that he's going to fight China. China's taking our jobs. He mentions it like a dozen times in the ad. This got natural earned media attention because there are Asian American political groups that said this was offensive. This was going to create more anti-Asian discrimination, hate. He has a left-wing primary opponent who attacked him for it. He didn't back down on it. He wasn't tweeting through it or being obnoxious about it. He just said, no, I've been saying this for years. This is my message. And so he kind of introduced himself pretty quickly as a Democrat who will stick to that, and which is important for Ryan because he also has evolved over the years. He was, when he was first elected in 2002, a pro-life Democrat, pro-life for a very long time. I mean, really until he started to look more at running for president, which he did. As Republicans moved out the field on abortion, and we're talking about full bans, he moved off from that. So he has moved left in important ways over the years, and also Vance has started talking about him at events the last few days, and his argument will be he is a Biden Democrat, Pelosi Democrat who has represented Northeast Ohio, and it hasn't gotten any better since he represented it. One of his lines is, only in politics can you have a job for 20 years, fail at it, and ask for a promotion. Ryan is pretty ready for that. I mean, I actually, before I heard Vance say that, I asked him, hey, if I were to run against you, I would say he's been representing Youngstown, and, did he fix Youngstown? I mean, he can just go on like the old Micro Machines commercials about like all of the various companies that have done something in the district or new businesses that have started. It's like, yes, and he will talk about the stuff that has come to the district. He's pretty good at it. He can go on autopilot. But yeah, the argument will be, as much as Ryan is right with voters on China, on trade, on a couple of those things, as much as you can talk about stuff he's passed, it is a Republican state. It is a good Republican year. And I think Vance does have some good counterpunches. As the outsider who nobody can blame for things not being great, that's going to be his argument.
But do you think he stands a chance?
I'd say a slim chance. I mean, just in this environment, there has been early polling where he does pretty well. I think I'd say he's running. This is happening a lot across the country. Democrats running smart early campaigns with enormous headwinds. Like if this was a 2018 race between Josh Mandel and Tim Ryan, I'm pretty sure Tim Ryan would win that. Not by a lot, maybe like by a couple points, like Sherrod Brown did. This race, I think, just those dynamics are tough. But it's a good test where you're going to have a candidate who's never run before as an outsider and has some natural talent. You're going to have a candidate running forever, has thought about a statewide race forever, and is pretty good at breaking with the National Democratic Party and sticking to it. So I think he's going to run a good campaign. He has so far, but this year, I mean, it's going to be tough. Just the same way I met amazing Republican candidates who did everything right in 2018. It just wasn't going to happen.
Well, Ohio is going to be a fun one to watch all the way through. Dave Weigel, thanks so much for watching the focus groups and for hanging out with us. We really appreciate it. Loved having you here. And thanks to all of you for listening to another episode of the focus group. We'll be back. It's primary season, so we got a lot more primaries coming up. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.